Matcha lattes are becoming very popular these days, and there are many different ways to make them. A lot of people find matcha green tea lattes to be a great way to incorporate matcha tea into their daily routine. In this video, we're going to walk you through the steps you can follow to make an excellent matcha latte at home. We'll start by talking about what you need to make an iced matcha latte and a matcha tea latte. Next, we'll tell you about 2 different matcha latte recipes you can try. Before we get started, it would really mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel and stay tuned for future tea videos. If you'd prefer to read about this topic, we have a great blog article about matcha lattes, and we'll put the link in the description below. Without further ado, let's get started. What's the definition of a matcha green tea latte? A matcha green tea latte is made by mixing matcha powder with a type of milk, usually a plant-based milk, and often with a type of sweetener. Matcha is traditionally consumed plain, but this recipe is adapted to accommodate consumer preferences in different parts of the world. An iced matcha latte is made with a mixture of cold milk and matcha powder, and then it's served with ice cubes. This iced matcha latte is more common during warmer months, and people even prefer to drink it year-round. What do you need to make a matcha green tea latte? There are a few things you need when it comes to making a matcha green tea latte. There are a couple of substitutions you can make, but it's best to follow this list as closely as possible. For a matcha green tea latte, you'll need 1 teaspoon of latte grade matcha, 2 teaspoons of sugar or another sweetener, 3 tablespoons of hot water, 300 milliliters of warm oat milk, soy milk, or coconut milk. For an iced matcha green tea latte, you'll need 1 teaspoon of latte grade matcha, 2 teaspoons of sugar, 3 tablespoons of cold water, 200 milliliters of cold oat milk, soy milk, or coconut milk, and then 5 matcha ice cubes. The best matcha latte recipe with a step-by-step guide. Step 1. Sifting the matcha powder. The first step when it comes to any matcha latte recipe is sifting the matcha powder. You may not find this step listed elsewhere, but it's very important nonetheless. Because matcha is ground up into such a fine powder, it's very sensitive to the humidity in the air. This causes it to form clumps once the package is open. The matcha is still fine to use when it has these clumps. It'll just be more difficult to mix into a matcha tea latte. We recommend to just run the powder through a sifter to remove these clumps. Once you have 2 grams of finely sifted powder at the bottom of the glass or bowl, you are ready to continue to the next step. Step 2. Making the matcha paste. The second step is one you may not see recommended on other matcha latte recipes, but we really think it makes a big difference for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it adds an extra opportunity to get the clumps out of the matcha. When you're working with a small quantity of water, it's easy to find the clumps and mix them into a smooth matcha paste. Even when making regular matcha tea, we recommend this step, as it can really improve the taste. In special Japanese tea ceremonies, the guests actually drink this matcha paste, or koicha. When drinking a matcha tea like this, all the flavors and health benefits are amplified. But if you're using a lower quality matcha, it can be incredibly bitter. That's why it's really important to go for a high quality okumidori matcha, like the matcha washimine, if you're drinking the koicha plain. The second benefit to creating the matcha paste is that it allows you to use less water. At this stage, you are just adding 3 tablespoons of warm water to the matcha powder and mixing it up. In other matcha latte recipes, you may find recommendations for much larger amounts of water, but we find this actually dilutes the matcha tea latte. With this added matcha paste step, you have more room for adding delicious oat milk and extra matcha flavor. Once you have the matcha paste, you are ready to continue to the next step. Step 3. Adding the warm milk to your matcha latte. This next step is pretty clear, but it's a very important bonus step you should follow, and that is to make sure that the milk is warm. Because we're using so little water, the temperature of the matcha tea latte will be determined by the temperature of the milk. That's why it's so important to make your milk warm or even hot before adding it to the matcha paste. The best way to do this is in a pan on the stove, but you can also use the microwave if you don't have access to a stove. Step 4. Adding the sweetener. Once you have the matcha tea and the oat milk mixed together, it's time to add in the sweetener. As we mentioned in other videos, sweetening your tea is probably not a good habit to rely on, but if you have to add the sweetener, see if you can add a little bit less each time you make the matcha tea latte. That being said, you can start off with 2 teaspoons of sugar and see how you like the taste. The plant milks tend to have their own sweetness to them, so even if you don't add the sugar, the matcha green tea latte still should be nice and sweet. When it comes to the type of sweetener you use, there are a few different options. Some people have talked about liking maple syrup, honey, or agave in their matcha latte, and you may even be surprised with brown sugar. Either way, it comes down to what taste you prefer most. Just make sure you try to experience the flavor of a matcha tea latte with less sweetener every once in a while. Step 5. Mixing up the matcha green tea latte. The best tool for this is the matcha whisk or chasen, but you can also use a milk frother if you don't have one. If you're using the bamboo whisk, make sure to rinse it well afterwards so you don't put it away dirty. After your matcha latte has been mixed up, it's ready to serve. Some people like to decorate the top of their matcha latte with a tiny bit of matcha powder, but don't feel the need to be fancy if you're just planning on drinking it right away. Now we get to the recipe for the iced matcha latte. While the iced matcha latte recipes are more or less the same, there are a few key differences that we will highlight for each step. Sifting the matcha powder. Just as with the warm matcha latte, you should also sift the matcha powder when making the iced green tea latte. This is especially important with an iced latte because it's harder to mix the powder into cold water. If the matcha doesn't mix in evenly, it will create a really unpleasant taste, so it's especially important to sift the teaspoon of matcha powder into the glass before preparing this iced green tea latte. Step 2. Making the matcha paste. As we mentioned before, it's especially difficult to mix matcha powder into an iced green tea latte, so you will need as much help as you can get. We will actually still be using 3 tablespoons of warm water for the iced matcha latte. The reason for this is that the warm water will help the matcha powder mix into a paste, and it will have little effect on the overall temperature in the drink. If you are still worried about making this drink too hot, you can also wait for a few minutes as the matcha paste cools down before adding the milk in the next step. Step number 3, adding in the cold milk. The temperature of the matcha tea latte will mostly come down at the temperature of the oat milk, so it's important to use colder milk. If you keep your oat milk in the fridge slightly chilled, this should be perfect. Because new cartons of oat milk and soy milk are usually not refrigerated, you may want to stick it in the fridge before making your iced matcha latte. Remember, for iced matcha latte recipes, we are using 200 milliliters of oat milk rather than 300 milliliters. Step number 4, adding sweetener. The sweetener step is slightly different when it comes to making a cold matcha latte because it will be harder to dissolve. You should still stir the sweetener into the iced matcha latte just as you would with the warm one, but this time just expect it to take a little bit more stirring before it mixes evenly. Once it's all mixed in and sweetened to your liking, you are ready to move on to the next step. Step number 5, adding the matcha ice cubes. This next step is probably the one most people are curious about. These matcha ice cubes may seem difficult to make, but they're actually quite easy. All you need to do is prepare a bowl of matcha tea and pour it out into an ice cube tray. Then you can just put the ice cube tray into the freezer and let it sit overnight. In the morning, you should have a dozen or so matcha ice cubes ready to be used in the matcha latte. In a regular glass of iced green tea latte, you should only need about 4 to 5 ice cubes, so you should only need to prepare a new tray a couple times a week. The reason that we use matcha ice cubes is that in addition to keeping the drink cold, they also concentrate the flavor of the matcha tea latte. The problem with regular ice cubes is that if you don't drink the iced matcha latte right away, they will melt and dilute your drink over time. These matcha ice cubes just add an extra flavor when they melt. Step number 6, mixing up the matcha green tea latte. The final step is mixing your iced matcha latte. If you find that the stirring is difficult with the ice cubes, you can move the stirring to step 5 and add in the ice cubes after. You will find it harder to stir with larger ice cubes compared to smaller ones, so you may want to invest in a different ice cube tray if you find that these larger ice cubes are a hassle. We hope you have found this video helpful when it comes to making your own matcha latte at home. If you'd like to pick up some latte matcha, we have a few available on our website, neoteas.com. It would really mean a lot to us if you could subscribe to the YouTube channel and like this video to see more like it in the future. If you have any questions about matcha or green tea in general, please feel free to leave them in the comments below. Until then, we'll see you next time.